So I'm a little unsure about how many of you are developers. This is going to be very much like a demo talk where I live code quite a bit. I copy paste a lot to speed it along. So feel free to ask questions along the way, and then we'll just do a little less coding, and I'll talk through the pieces that we don't like end up getting to do all the coding demos for everything, because it's better that you ask and get answers to questions that you have. So yeah, as my introduction, I am Benedicte. I'm a web developer here in Oslo, Norway. You might know me as Queen Raae from the rem-fueled and unauthorized treasure hunts around the Gatsby Islands that we have been doing weekly since April, and they are now on Thursday, if you want to keep up with some Gatsby goodness. I've also created POW, the Privacy First Menstrual Cycle Journal. Funnily enough, this page is Squarespace, but the app itself is made with Gatsby. And just last week, I got nominated for a Jamstack Award. So if you get bored during my talk, head on over and vote for me here in the middle. I think voting is open until tomorrow. So that's a little bit about me. I also hold a master in computer science from way back when, and been independent for the last 10 years, I guess. So let's have a little look at our outline. So we're going to do a little bit. I'm going to bump up the font size and let me know if that is not big enough. We'll do a little bit of an intro to Gatsby, and I'll show you minimal Gatsby setup. We'll talk about Gatsby plugins, the data layer, serverless functions. We'll touch on some new stuff that came out 2 weeks ago with Gatsby 4, with all of these fun acronyms, and then we'll head on over to a summary. So what is Gatsby? So originally, or kind of at its core, Gatsby is a static site generator. What that means is that there is no backend working when somebody hits the site. Everything is pre-built. At the time of changes to content, you rebuild the whole site, and that is deployed. You can think of it kind of like deploying the cache of a WordPress site and then just turning off WordPress. That is basically at its core what it is. It does make a lot of changes to how we think about our user experience and how we build our sites, because you have to think about everything with that pre-building in mind. But interestingly, with Gatsby, which is based on React, which is a framework, a JavaScript framework, whenever somebody hits the site, like this site, this is Gatsby site, it so-called hydrates and becomes a React application. So if we hit some of these links that are part of their site, you don't get that page load that we are used to from kind of the WordPress and Drupal world, where everything is server-side rendered. So this is like the first load is just regular HTML, and then the JavaScript comes in, and then it so-called rehydrates and becomes one of these single page applications or a React application. And this gives us then the possibility to do a lot of kind of dynamic, fun stuff on the page after it's been hydrated. So it's weird when you call it like a static site generator, everything is static, but it's also very dynamic, and it all gets very confusing very fast. And that's why I hope we're going to do some demos here today. So maybe it will help you to kind of see what is happening, just not like talk about it. There's also a great tutorial from Gatsby if you want to get into Gatsby that makes very little assumptions about your skill level, and you can go through on your own pace. We'll be doing quite a lot today just so that you can get a feel for different parts of Gatsby, and you will also get access to my code at some point. So if you want to watch this video over and kind of look into the code yourself, then that is also possible. So any questions so far? It's hard for me to see you and my code. Let's see where you're at. They're at. So raise your hands if you want to say anything or just like blurt out. So there's a raised hand. Pavel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
May I?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you said, that is static, but actually the react this way after the hydrate process, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, how about the CEO of the Gatsby products? However, it's probably going later on this course.
So this is one of the things, like I didn't do in my outline, as you said, I didn't do an SEO part, but we can have a little bit of look at that like in detail or in code later. But what happens with, so if you made a React application, then you kind of just would, whatever page you wanted to land on, that would be, everything had to load in after you land on the page. But since Gatsby statically generates all pages, like every page is an entry point into your application, which means that for Google, all of these pages are separate pages that they can index and can have separate metadata for this, for SEO purposes. So you kind of get I guess like what we said with static generation is like you get the best of both worlds when it comes to SEO, because you will kind of generate all the pages and you will have SEO metadata on each page. But then when whatever page you land on, the site hydrates or rehydrates and becomes a React application. While if you just like deploy the regular React application, you only have one entry point, and Google looks at that as just one page.
Okay, so in theory, this hydrate process is only enchanting the application, and it's don't have impact, negative impact on the SEO.
Yes, that is correct. Very good put. Very well put. I should
I mean,
note that down for my next presentation.
that's nice.
But it is easy to, just as with like I did a lot of WordPress before as well, like just as with WordPress on any site, like you can mess up the SEO, right? So you have to make sure that you test it out and you do things correctly. And there are like some fallgruver, some things, some things that are easier to mess up with Gatsby than other frameworks. Like other frameworks have other things that they make it easier to mess up with. So yeah, but yeah, that was like one of the big things when Gatsby came out, because then or the static site generators, JavaScript static site generators came out. That was like a big thing, because at the time you had to choose between regular type server-side rendered paradigm like WordPress, or like a React JavaScript application, and you kind of missed that middle piece if you wanted to have kind of like a React application. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is kind of make a very minimal Gatsby site. And why I do this is because I do really like the Gatsby documentation, but they are in the same way as with WordPress, like they are very much based on you wanting to use starters and plugins and kind of different things to speed along the process. So when you start looking into Gatsby, it feels like there's a lot that has to be in place. But we're now going to look at like the most minimal Gatsby site you could set up. So a regular or a Gatsby site needs Gatsby, of course, as its dependency. And then we have some scripts that are put up for that are nice to have, that just use Gatsby develop, Gatsby build, Gatsby serve, and Gatsby clean. And what they need is a source folder and a pages folder. And inside the pages folder, you can then just pop in JavaScript files, and these pages will become, what's inside this pages folder will become pages when we build. And it's mandatory then to create a component and export it as default. And what is exported as default is what's going to be the component for the page. So if we then do, I already ran Gatsby develop. And what we then can see is that we have this welcome site. It's really pretty. As you will see, we will not be going into styling for this demo. And then we have the 404 page. And then also Gatsby comes with this like really nice, when you're in development mode, it comes with this really nice kind of custom 404 page here that will actually let you know what pages have been created. So if we don't go to develop, but we do then the build, we'll see that we get a public folder. I've done this before today, so there's already a public folder. And this is the folder that will be deployed. This is what you put on the server. And as you can see, there's the 404 page, but there's also a 404 folder here for the page. And if you look at that, that's like all of our index content in here. And when I ran this before, I also had a test. Yeah, see, now it's done. So we got our 404 and we got our index. Oh, it's not done yet. Because I'm streaming as well, this is like my computer slows down. There we go. There's the index file. And then there's a 404, both as a 404 HTML and also inside of the folder. So it gets that like nice URL. And if we then add a test file or test page, I just copy paste the index page, and it's like nice form to rename these. And we'll do test. We build again, we'll see that that will also come up as one of these folder inside of the inside of this public folder. And you usually don't do build when you're doing local development. You just do npm run develop or Gatsby develop, and that's kind of your development environment. And it will do some optimization for you, so not everything is built all the time. It will just kind of build on demand what you need while you're developing. But I just wanted to show you this, if you want to kind of like have a real like deep dive into what is actually generated, it's what's in this public folder, and that is what we deploy or your hosting service deploys. And usually you will deploy a Gatsby site either to Netlify or Gatsby Cloud, because they have really nice DevOps set up so that you can just push to Git, and then as soon as you merge anything to main, poof, it's out and live, which is quite different from how I remembered WordPress development being back in the day. So you can see now we have this test page, and it also has an index in there, and it's minimized and everything for you. And it's nice to just keep having npm run develop going as you keep on working on the site. So the first, question?
Yeah, here.
Yeah.
You usually have your data, like for example, content or equivalent to post types of WordPress in some sort of backend, like headless Drupal, headless WordPress, or some other backends.
Yeah.
But when you are adding a new, let's say, post or page to the backend, how you will generate the front end? So you should, after clicking on publish the backend, go and run npm run build again?
Yes, that is exactly what's going to happen. So we can talk about more of that when we come to the data layer, where we're going to connect to a WordPress site and pull data in from a WordPress site. But that's why I see not that many people will self-host these types of sites, because you need kind of that DevOps around it, where you have webhooks coming in. So whenever you do a change on your WordPress site like that, will then send the webhook over to Gatsby Cloud, for instance, that asks the site to be rebuilt, and then it's rebuilt and deployed for you without you having to like do the deploy step, because in a static site generation paradigm, you end up deploying a lot because you have to deploy every time that content changes. Did that answer your question? And we'll look more into it in the data layer.
Yeah, I got it, but that means that like if you have WordPress backend, you should hook some sort of API requests to the Gatsby backend to trigger the npm run build.
Yes. So if you have like a smaller site where you have the content as maybe markdown files inside of your site, then it will, every time you push something up to your GitHub repository, that will trigger a rebuild. Like that's one way to do it if you have more of local content. But if you have content in a headless CMS or like headless WordPress, then that instance of WordPress will need to ask the Netlify or Gatsby Cloud to rebuild your site whenever something changes.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So that was kind of like the intro. I just wanted to show that you can get started by just having an index.js file inside of a pages folder, and kind of that's it. You can start playing around from there, because I know some people like to start there and some people like to start with like a full-fledged starter that has everything, and then you start digging in. There's just like two ways of learning, and Gatsby is very much focused on the kind of lots of stuff is done for you, and it seems like you have to have a lot of stuff in place. So I just wanted to show you like how little you need to have in place to start a Gatsby project. So over to plugins. Gatsby has like a million plugins. Well, not a million plugins, because they've not been around for as long as as WordPress. And it's definitely the case where I feel like it's very much in the kind of beginning days of WordPress, where it's really hard to know what plugins are good and what plugins are bad, and people keep throwing plugins at their Gatsby site, and then something breaks. Like we all know this from WordPress development, I think, where it's like you just add on, and then at some point these plugins don't work together. And there is like no real solution for that other than what has happened in the WordPress community, where some people or some providers and makers of plugins become more reputable than other providers. But it's probably a good idea to have a good look at the plugins that you want to use and see kind of what people are behind it and how well is it maintained. And then there's also official plugins. They have this little official sign on them, and those will be pretty good to use. Like you can trust those. And you can see that there are plugins for a lot of things. We have Contentful, and we also have WordPress here. It's an official plugin. There's a Drupal official plugin. And then Sanity has a plugin that's made by them. So it's not made by Gatsby, but it's still like a really good plugin. So these on the front page, of course, are pretty good plugins. But you can, if you go for like Google Analytics, I think there's like a ton. Yeah, there's like Google Analytics, and then there's Google Tag Manager, and then it might be hard to like know exactly which one you should use. But I feel like folks coming from the WordPress community kind of has a little bit of a sense for how plugins can both really speed up your development, but also suddenly break everything, right? So just be mindful of that. I'm going to show you how to add just as I've created this tiny plugin that will add new CSS. I was wrong. I will add like simple styling to your page, so you don't have to think about styling when making demos. And it's one of my plugins just to show you how it's done. So as with everything JavaScript, we have to we add plugins by downloading them or installing them from the plugin from npm as a package. There's other ways to do it as well. You can have your own plugins that just live on Gatsby, but it's in the same way you would install any JavaScript or npm package. And I've done this already because this will take a lot of time. And to use plugins, you then add kind of the next minimal thing you need with a Gatsby site, and that's a Gatsby Config. Gatsby Config file. And everything that happens kind of in the build step on the back end runs in a node environment. So you still use JavaScript, but it's vanilla JavaScript that runs in a node environment. Everything you do that creates pages and then rehydrates and happens on the browser will be in React. So both is JavaScript, but of course we don't write kind of React on the back end. Well, we might when React 18 comes out, but not yet. And what is needed is an array of plugins. And we are then going to use my plugin, and it doesn't have any options. And when it rebuilds, hopefully we see some styling happening. This is going so slow because of streaming. And sometimes we just need to rerun npm run develop. Of course, I've managed to do something wrong at this point. And then you always do run clean, that like cleans up everything. And if it doesn't work, I have backups, so we can just move along to something that works. Yeah. Oh, I think maybe we do have to install it. Any other questions while I figure out my... if you've done any JavaScript development, you know that this is kind of the pain of our existence, is making these packages work together.
I think there's a mistake in Gatsby Config in declaration of array.
Plugins. How though? Let me do. I have this example that has a lot of them in there. Yeah, and I think it's good. I think though, let's try again. And if it doesn't work, we'll move on to the next one, which is more interesting for you because that will be the data layer where we end up calling in a lot of things. Yeah. Why do these things always fail when you go on stream? Because I'm correct in like you use a lot of WordPress when you create for clients, right? At the moment.
We're probably bigger on Drupal and some other technologies, but yeah, we also use WordPress.
I know what the problem is, because then package log file is. This was the problem on stream the other day as well. Last one, or we move along because I do have backups, as I said. Might be a problem with my package, like the package working with npm is always it's a black hole of issues. Yes, I don't have any Drupal experience. That's why I'm referencing WordPress when I do reference things, because it's easier.
No problem.
Let's see if this works. If not. So Gatsby has gotten quite, like, you might have heard problems with the npm develop, like really slowing down or like breaking all the time. It usually, when I don't try to do like several demos at once, it usually somehow it's not, oh, now I need to do the clean, and then hopefully it will work. But it usually works a lot better these days. So when I do prep these things, like my package logs get totally out of whack. Because I was hoping to keep on building on this. Yeah, I don't know what is. It's messing me. It's messing with me.
I guess someone forgot to pray to the demo gods.
Yes, I did. I did. Because I was hoping to pre-install all of these so that we didn't have to do all of this, but it seems like I should not have done that. Because I want to keep working on this so that you can see how we add. But I'm gonna just quickly skip ahead to the data layer while these things happen in the background. So I've set up this Ruby's time travel blog on a local instance of WordPress. So what we want to do in the data layer section is that we want to source data from this WordPress site but use it in our Gatsby site, right? That is often what we want to do, as somebody pointed out in the questions, is like we have our data somewhere else and we want to source it into Gatsby. And one of the benefits and pains of Gatsby is the so-called data layer. So instead of having you just source, they call it sourcing content, instead of just having you import data nilly-willy, they want you to conform to a standard. I really like it because I like it when things are a little more kind of standardized. But I know a lot of JavaScript developers do not like that because it gives you a lot of kind of form and hoops you have to jump to make sure that everything conforms. But the great thing about it is that you then get a very uniform data layer that you can then use to query data into your kind of React or your Pages application. So this is a image from the Gatsby docs, and it says here you can source from pretty much anywhere. You can source from your file system, you can source from any CMS, you can source from a private API, you can source from a database. There are plugins to source from all kinds of places, and you can also create your own, you can also source yourself, either by creating your own plugins or by just doing it directly inside of your project, which makes it quite flexible. And everything ends up being source nodes that you then get access to via a GraphQL data layer. And that means you kind of have to learn GraphQL, which is like the new hot thing instead of a REST API. I must say that I have not spent like a ton of time learning GraphQL because there is this nice like visual representation of the data you have. And then I kind of just like copy paste whatever queries I need and like look at the documentation. But if you really want to become like a really savvy Gatsby person, you probably also should spend some time learning GraphQL properly. And to set a WordPress site up, it's kind of funny because you need plugins on both sides. So for your WordPress site, you need to set up the Gatsby plugin and also the GraphQL plugin. So what happens here with the GraphQL plugin gives us a GraphQL access to all of the data inside of a WordPress installation. And you could use that without using Gatsby. But then you have the Gatsby plugin that then makes sure that you can talk to kind of the Gatsby source WordPress plugin. So I've set that up already, and there's a GraphQL IDE inside of WordPress, and we'll see this similar thing inside of Gatsby. So here is kind of all the data that you have available from the WordPress site, and this is what I mean by you might not have to like learn GraphQL 100% because you can go through here and you see, oh, posts, oh, edges, nodes, and then you can see, oh, I want the content, I want the excerpt, I want the featured image data, or is this sticky? So the thing with GraphQL that is different from REST APIs are that you only ask for the data you want, while in a REST API, you often like get all the data that the backend has decided for you. But with GraphQL, the consumer of the API lets the backend know what kind of data it wants. Oh, I see that some nice. You need to change my little. I don't think that's the problem. I see somebody was in the chat. So hopefully this runs now so we can start doing some fun stuff. If not, we'll just jump to what I had that worked just before this stream and have a look at the code instead of me live coding. So does anyone have an experience with GraphQL? Have you had a look at that in any of your projects already? And now we're up and running. We just had to nuke everything, which is, there we go. Now you see this beautiful styling instead of, instead of just having regular old HTML styling, we now have this amazing styling. So for the next step, then we want to connect this site to our, our Ruby's Time Travels website. And we do this, and then this is why I was hoping so we didn't have to like install these, but then we need to install the npm Gatsby. And I'm going to look at my cheat sheet. Gatsby source WordPress, which is the npm install. Is the plugin to source data from a WordPress site. And then we also need some other fun stuff that I can do while we do something else. And then we have to configure that the same way we did with the, like my simple plugin here that doesn't have any configuration. This is a way to use a plugin with configuration. And you can see here that there's a lot of settings, but the one you really truly need is the URL that tells you where is this instance of your WordPress GraphQL server. And for me, it's on localhost 888 that we just looked at. And it now says, oh, it needs to rebuild because we've changed the config. And then we'll have a look at the GraphQL on the Gatsby side of things and see how we can generate pages from. And you can see now there's like a lot of things happening. Things are coming in, and it says Gatsby plugin sharp wasn't set up correctly. And that is image handling in Gatsby. So to handle images, we need the Gatsby transformer sharp, the Gatsby plugin sharp, and the Gatsby image plugins. So as you can see, like there is a lot of plugins at play that need to work together when you start getting into more complex setups. Gatsby's gotten really good with how it like gives us information so we can figure out what is wrong. And the way we want to create these pages, I'm going to let this like play out in the background. Inside of pages, instead of having these regular JS files, we can create what is called Gatsby file system route API files, and they have curly brackets around them. So we've ended up calling them parrot pages because they look like parrots. Anyway, it's still complaining. Let's set up everything in our Gatsby file. We don't need any of the options for those plugins either. And the way we make pages is that we kind of we get some data off of this like GraphQL query that we're going to look at in a minute. But to make a page from a WordPress page, so for every WordPress page in our WordPress instance, we want to create a page with this kind of template. We have to say VP page. That's the name inside of the GraphQL query. It's going to be VP page and then .URI because that's the data we want to use for our paths.
Good dog.
This is taking longer than I thought. I'm so sorry.
Oh.
You get a real feel for it. So one way then is to create pages is to use these Gatsby file system file system route API to create pages. And then the only thing you get to know inside of this template is the ID of the content node that you want to have access to inside of there. So if we have a look at our dev site now, I'm just like, this is just okay. We're going to go over to our cheat sheet because this is just do not want to cooperate with me today. And we'll just have a look through.
So do you get GraphQL for free when you install Gatsby?
Yes, but you only get GraphQL during the build step. So you will not get kind of access to the graph. It won't deploy a server that you can use later as the GraphQL. As a GraphQL server, it only creates a server that you can use during your build step. So we've jumped over to ready-made code because that's going to be so much quicker. We have a look here at our site. This is basically the front page as we see. But I wanted to head on over to the GraphQL. So for every page, let's look at the page first. This is our GraphQL visual. So we want to have all of our WordPress pages become pages inside of Gatsby. So we go to the nodes, we look at what kind of data does it have, and it's got the URE, which is a good point. This is a good data point to use as the path for our pages. So in my Gatsby site, I've created these curly brackets, and this is the Gatsby file system route API. So this is one way to then create pages, and all of these will then be replaced with this data. So if we have a look at our dev 404, we see that we have the blog page, we have the about page, and we have the index page, right? The 404 page is still the one we made using JavaScript, but you could source that from WordPress if you wanted to as well. And then you can see down here, we have category London, category Oslo, and then also a tag. And how I get those is if we go to look at the WordPress or go to the GraphQL again. If we look at the WordPress term node, and then what do I do? Term node URI as well. Then it goes and fetches all of these nodes, and then they create a page for each one. And if we look inside of our pages, then to get the data we need, we have to create a GraphQL query. So each page exports a default component that is kind of the design of our page. And then it exports a query, and that's the query for the page. That's a page query. And the data that we source inside of this GraphQL query is added to the component as a data prop. And then we can fetch whatever data we need from our query and then use that in our design. And the interesting part here is that, okay, this is a file system route API page. The only thing it gets in automatically is this ID, and that's the ID of the node. So to fetch the data we need, we say, okay, we want to get the WordPress page that has the same ID. We want the title, the content, the slug, the URI, and I want to check if it's a front page and if it's a post page. And I wanted to check if it's a post page, because if it's a post page, I'm going to need all of these WordPress posts that are then sorted by date and order of descending. And then it uses this little fragment so that I don't have to retype every time I need the data that is like the excerpt and stuff like that. So we can have a look at the component, and it's the teaser. So it uses this fragment title, excerpt, and URI that again uses a fragment of featured image and post meta that we find here in the post meta, and then the featured image and the featured image post. So that's one way to kind of create pages. The good thing about this is like it's super easy. It's very easy to see inside of our pages folder what type of kind of templates we have. We know that now there's going to be a page for every WordPress page. There's going to be a page for every WordPress node. But when it comes to posts, like often with WordPress or often with blogs and posts, we want to be able to say next page and past page. And we don't get that data kind of given to us inside of the context of these file system route API pages. So another way to create pages is if you create a Gatsby node file. So Gatsby node files are just a file that is then run by Gatsby, and it has different kinds of hooks that you can hook into when the page is building. So one of those is create pages. So then we say inside create pages, we are going to again do then a GraphQL query, and we're going to get all of our posts, but then we're going to chunk it up so that, we're going to get all of our posts, but we're also getting not just information about the node, we're also going to get information about the previous node and the next node. So when we create our page, we then ourselves have to say what path is set. Like this is what is done automatically when we use these file system route APIs. This path is set automatically with whatever is inside the curly brackets. And then we have to say manually what template should we use for that. When we do it with the file system route API, it's that template or it's the component that's inside of the file. And then we can add context. So within the file system route API, the only context we get is ID, while now we're allowed to like put in whatever we want, the previous post ID or the next post ID. And that gives us more flexibility into what kind of information, what kind of data we want to show and what kind of functionality we want on our pages. And to the astute listener, then it's like, okay, on this, either on the blog page or on like a node archive or a terminology archive kind of page, this will not work if we have like 400 or 500 pages, right? Because then it's going to get this gets all the WordPress posts. So that's when you also have to go in and like rethink and then use create pages instead, so that you can create, a category Oslo, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, and you have to do those things then yourself inside of the create pages. So as you can see, you get a lot more control than you get with kind of in the WordPress setup, but there is not as much magically happening for you as when you are using a system like WordPress that has both the CMS and the front end in one. Yep. So I think that's on the data layer. And if you want to create your own nodes instead of using a plugin, as I said, you can source nodes from anywhere. Then it's another kind of API entryway in this Gatsby node. You can then do Gatsby create nodes, and then you can just like ask any API, and you start creating nodes inside of this Gatsby node file. So a very good way to get to familiarize yourself with Gatsby is to go in and have a look at all of their like lifecycle APIs to see what is available, because I see a lot of people hack solutions without having looked at that API kind of lifecycle events. So these are the pages, and then these are the categories. So if we go to our page, we can see here that this is the front page, and it also uses that the block system. So this is one block, and then it's our latest post block down here. And if we go to our Gatsby site, it's not as pretty, but it's got the same information. This is that top block, and this is the next or the latest blog posts. And you go to the blog post page, we have the information about the blog post, and then the next and previous, like we talked about.
Question, Benedicte?
Yeah.
So what does the output from Gutenberg actually look like?
so that's where we can have fun with the GraphQL. I mean, spend a lot of time playing around in here. This is where the juicy stuff is. If we go on over here and we do content and we hit play, you see that we get whatever is stored in the database. So this is one of the limitations, right, with WordPress, is that it stores all its data as ready HTML. So you can't kind of get to the data that when it's not HTML. At least that's how it was when I was working with it. So you get content and it's already HTML in here. So then you get all of your classes and everything that you would get if you were creating these templates inside of the WordPress kind of paradigm.
Okay, sure, but I don't see any Gutenberg specific stuff in there, is there?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's a little small.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. Block column.
Right.
Yeah. So you get all of the content kind of similarly as you would have. I guess this would be, yeah, in your PHP, if you ask for the content of a page, this is the same thing, just in the graphical setting. So one important aspect of that is that in React, we are not allowed to just like add content that we cannot just like add HTML without saying that we specifically want to add HTML. So there are a couple of ways to do it, and I see that the WordPress community have used this HTML React parser package. So you then do parse content, and it has to have some content, otherwise it will fail. So I had a little in case there's no content. Another way to do this is to use React's dangerously set in their HTML. So when we do these things, we have to make sure that the HTML we are, adding to our pages is legal and good and secure HTML. In the same way, we have to do it when we just add HTML, because in React we write with JSX, and it will actually strip out all JavaScript for us without us having to think about it. But you need to be able to handle the HTML as HTML and not just as text.
Mm-hmm.
And what did I want to say about? Yes. So and this is, as we saw here, this is what's called a dynamic query, because it has variables coming in. It's got the ID coming in, and we run a query that is then dependent on that variable. But you could also see that I have the menu up here, and this is not a hard, like all of the data in this page on this site is not, none of it is hard coded. It's all coming from WordPress. So let's have a look at to see how we can manage to make this header thing. And it's in, so I created a layout component, and you can see here we use what is called the use static query. So that is different from a dynamic query because it doesn't take any variables. So we cannot add a variable. We cannot give a prop into this component and then use that as a variable in a static query. Static query needs to be the same every time it's run. It can't be dependent on anything. But then we see that there's a VP node. If we go to our Gatsby, to our Graphql again, there's a VP node with general settings. So then we have the title and the description. We can see here we get the title and we get the description. So I'm asking for that, and then I use it in my header. And I have to remember to parse that as well, because as we can see, there are a little bit of like HTML or like thing in there, and otherwise it will be handled as text. And the same thing with the primary menu that I've added up here. It's a static query. So I'm asking for the primary menu, see equals primary menu. So I could not add a variable in here and then say secondary menu. It has to be, static query has to be completely static. And then I ask for that, and I return, and I create this menu. And the interesting thing here is that, that's why I put the Gatsby in there. If it's link for something that is not on our site, we want it to be a regular link. But if we want it to be on our site, we need to use the Gatsby's own kind of link component, because otherwise it will trigger a reload. And then we're no longer getting the benefits, right, of Gatsby. Because if I click here, it's like super fast because it's just inside of a React application. But if I trigger a reload, it's going to ask for that request again from the server. So then you have to be vigilant about, is this an internal path or an external path, and make sure that you use the correct component, which is weird because in a regular, or not weird, but is uncommon or unusual for us if we come from a server-side rendered background, because everything there would be like a proper link, right? Not like an internal JavaScript link that doesn't trigger a reload. And that is like important to make sure to get right. Otherwise, everything will just be a reload anyway, and you could have skipped the whole static generation part, right? Yeah, so that was dynamic queries and static queries that people often trip up on. Questions to all these queries?
So you're saying this...
Now I feel like you're just confused. I'm really sorry if this doesn't make sense at all.
No, you're doing good, and this is powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So when it comes to what's standardized, as you said, would you say that that makes Gatsby a good candidate to kind of like have one way of doing front end while being more flexible on what kind of backends you use, so that you can kind of, as a person handling the front end, it doesn't matter that much what kind of source you're using, right?
Yeah, so that's what I really like about the kind of the data layer, which is if you're just working on your kind of side project, this gets very tedious, right? Because you just want to add some data, and then you have to add it to the data layer, and then you have to get it from the data layer, and then you have to make sure that the schemas are correct, that they're getting the right data and all of that. But if for a bigger team where people are responsible for different parts of the site or the product, then this kind of solution makes a lot of sense, right? Because then somebody can be responsible to load things into the data layer, and then the people working on the site, like more purely front-end developers, can then kind of just use the data from the data layer, because it's a little bit of a different skill set on when you are working to create these source plugins, or just do them. You can do them right in that Gatsby node file, but I recommend creating plugins if you're, to modularize your code. But so the skill set there is more of kind of a Node.js backend JavaScript type of skill set, where you are calling APIs and you're doing a lot of things in a node environment. While when you're creating the page templates and the components, that is more of like a pure kind of React front end kind of skill set. So I really like this graph or this data layer in the middle, so that we have kind of that meeting point.
Could you also touch briefly on deployment to Netlify or Gatsby Cloud?
The plugins, or how to do it?
Yeah, basically just the basics of how it works.
How it works. Let's look at a site. Should we do? You want to see the serverless functions, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, just I'm going to look over my notes to see if there was something I forgot here. Yeah, no, so this is, yeah, so we put things into the data layer, creating data nodes, and then we use the data nodes in our pages and components to pull in the data and display it. I guess that's basically it. So we can quickly do that first. So to connect to Gatsby Cloud or Netlify, you often, I'm gonna not share my screen because then, okay. The way you often do it is that you connect Gatsby Cloud or Netlify to your GitHub repository. And whenever there are changes to the GitHub repository, they will rebuild your site. So I can quickly log into my Gatsby Cloud account. That's why I took it off screen, so that it's easier to so you don't see my credentials in case they're...
Yeah. So does Gatsby Cloud do basically exactly the same thing as Netlify?
They do exactly the same thing as Netlify. They just do it a little bit better for Gatsby sites. Okay. But it's the basic same kind of process where you add a site, you hook it up to your repository, and then they are connected. So if I have a look at my main site here, it gives us a lot of info on when it's been built. And what is really nice, which is what kind of Netlify pioneered, is that it will also build every pull request. So you don't have to wait until you've merged something into main. You can set it up so that it builds every pull request, or you can set it up to, I'm not sure with Gatsby Cloud, but at least with Netlify, you can also say that there should be like a test branch or another branch that should always also be built, and they all get their separate URLs, because since we are in this world where everything is built and statically generated, then they can just deploy that, and it can be deployed as is forever and ever, right? Because if it's worked, then it's always going to work. So you can see here for every pull request, it creates its own build, and you can have a look at the build at that point in time. So this is like the summer, but if we go to my page now, right, it looks completely different. But this pull request will always stay up as a built site. And then you can set up these webhooks that you can then call to preview or build your site. And when you set up your Gatsby source inside of your when you set up the plugins for WordPress, you can add lots of information here that will then do that automatically for you. So you put in your build webhook, and you can enable what is called Gatsby Preview, where they kind of bypass the whole bid process, so you can preview your pages. I've heard people have a lot of it's not 100% smooth sailing yet. When it works, but there's it's a little finicky. And then you set that up, and then all of these things talk together. But as in all kind of systems that are more distributed, there are points for failure that are different from what we're used to when everything is in one box, like in WordPress, right? Did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But the benefits, like now, it's like sounds like Gatsby is not something you should do. I do really enjoy using Gatsby, especially as a front-end developer. I really enjoy working in it, because I have learned React, and I like to write my sites in React. And you can create component. You can split your site and project into components in the way that I like better than I could when I was using like regular WordPress. And the power comes, as you kind of alluded to, is when you can connect all of these data sources. Because if you're just going to source data from a WordPress site, I would just let it be a WordPress site. Like WordPress really works, and Drupal and all of these things, they're battle tested. But if you want to create a site that has like a different kind of feature set, or behaves more like a web application, and you need that for some reason, and maybe you want to merge the data coming in from content coming in from WordPress with data coming in from an API, and then maybe also some user-generated data coming in from like Instagram or Twitter or something like that, and you want to kind of merge that together. Gatsby called it the content mesh in the beginning when they started with Gatsby. Somehow they've stopped using that terminology. I really like that. So you can then merge data from all kinds of places, and then put that into that data layer, and get a uniform way of using that in your kind of then React application, basically, that you're making with Gatsby. So I wouldn't recommend just like creating any WordPress site as a Gatsby site, just because like there needs to be a little bit more of a need for something dynamic or user experience, or there are all kinds of data that you want to mesh together in that content mesh. That's where Gatsby shines.
Mm-hmm. Sure, or you might want to use the same endpoint to deploy multiple domains.
Yes. And also, my thinking is that if you have a large client, let's say, one of the large newspapers ran on, I'm gonna say you don't have to look at this page when we're just talking. If you are like a large newspaper, and I see a lot of them now are testing out if you have like this fancy article, you want that to have a totally different experience, and you want to prototype it or test it out and do something where you don't want to kind of be hindered by the template system you already have, then I think spinning up Gatsby and having like that as like a mini site that then fetches the data from WordPress or wherever the editor is already, or the journalists and editors and content people are already comfortable creating the content, then the developers can experience or experiment with it as a mini site without having to have the whole organization kind of move over to something else. And like a pro tip is also you can use Google Sheets as a backend. So if you want to like prototype something and you want maybe see this travel blog, maybe I would want all of the posts about Oslo on an Oslo mini site. I could also just add some content to a Google Sheet and then mesh that together if I wanted to. Does that make sense?
Totally, and I even think the latter example makes sense in big content-centric projects where you want to see what your source content looks like in a front end. So.
Yep. Okay, so let's move on to some other like juicy new stuff. I need to share my screen again. No, not window. Okay, so with Gatsby, the latest official version of Gatsby, you now get a serverless functions as part of this kind of nice deploy. That wasn't so nice in the beginning because I'd messed up the package lock, but that is usually pretty nice that you're just here in this develop kind of setting, and you can create serverless functions endpoints inside of here. And you've been asking about Netlify. So Netlify has had Netlify functions for quite some time, and they now also have support for Gatsby functions, while Gatsby Cloud only has support for Gatsby functions. And the difference being is that if you use Netlify functions, you would have to kind of go into another kind of setup system. They need to build that separately from your Gatsby site, and it's not like seamlessly integrated. It's harder to test the functions when you're just in the development environment because they're not like natively a part of Gatsby. So how to get Gatsby functions running is by creating a folder inside of source, and then we can do an hello world example. And to create a function, serverless function, you need to export a default function, and that's basically it. And we should now have a function available to us on that data. As you can see here now, functions, hello world, yes. And it says hello world because that is what we're sending back, right? A very boring example, so I'm going to make a much more fun example for everyone. And that is, we're going to time travel. So we can see we have in our company a little bit of a time travel. We like time travels. So let's make the time ship. And we need an index file where we're going to have the form for travel, and then we need a success page for when we are successfully traveled. I'm just going to copy paste some code that I already have for this. And then we're just going to jump over to the cheat sheet for that as well, so we're sure nothing is. So we have the time ship, we have the index, and we have the success page. So hopefully this will run. And what we want to do for a time travel is that we don't want people to just time travel nilly-willy. We want them to pay a lot of money to time travel. So we have created a time travel function, and it will handle both post requests and get requests. And if it's a post handler, we're going to create a Stripe session, checkout session. And then the get handler, we will get information about the Gatsby or the Stripe checkout session. And the reason we want to do this instead of just using the Stripe checkout, they have like this Stripe checkout that you can use only from the front end, is that it is less customizable. So you are not allowed to, for instance, then add metadata. So we're going to add the metadata for the year you're traveling to in the city, so that that will be on our Stripe checkout session, and we can then fetch that same metadata later on if we need to. So if we go to time travel or a time ship, we should be able to time travel. And maybe I didn't put my environment variables in. I'm going to take you off screen for just a second.
No problem.
So with Gatsby, you get environment variables as part of the setup. And if you do end.development, and you have environment variables. I don't know if I'm off my game today, where things are not working like they did 2 hours ago. And we are building. And the nice thing we can do now also is that we can then go into our WordPress site and add a menu item here that will, we could do a custom link, but we started with a slash, then it will be a local link. Then that should pop up in our menu when everything builds.
Nice.
As you can see now, we have the time travel, and if we go to the API, we say faulty time machine because it's not like nothing is gonna, we don't have the correct data. And then if we go to localhost, it hasn't shown up yet, but it will at some point. And of course, something is failing. So let's do clean. And then make sure it's saying that this, oh, I didn't save menu, I think. Haven't used WordPress in a while. And this is like the thing that people do complain about with Gatsby, is that after you do a clean, like everything has, you know, the whole kind of data layer needs to be reinitialized. So it needs to fetch all the data from WordPress, and it needs to figure out what the schema looks like, you know, for every node. So that's why you want to, you know, stay in development mode without having to do a clean, because then everything is going to take a little longer again. So now we have the time ship.
Yay.
And let's see if this works now.
Hold on.
Hold on. We are redirected to Stripe. I can pay.
That's not even expensive.
Exactly. It's like 424. 24. We're in test mode. Always make sure you're in test mode on Stripe. Otherwise, it's going to be inexpensive. Oh, and I didn't write success correctly, which is like my issue always. But now it's, you see, did you see that little like fetching your travels?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where we get that static versus dynamic. Like we cannot generate this page with information about that session on build, right? So we're building the page, but we're leaving that little space to fetch in some dynamic data. And if you do it correctly, like now you see the page shifted down, but you can do, you know, I've looked at your stuff, like, you know, the front end styling stuff. So I that's why we're not focusing on that. But, you know, you can leave little blank spaces and then you fill that up with the data when you load on the page. So if you go to that success page, if you're familiar with React, and you see here inside of use effect, whenever the session ID up here changes, this will happen, and we will then query for, we will set the session ID, and then when it changes, we will fetch that travel and get information back. So every time we now reload, this is going to fetch, right? And that's how you can make the static dynamic, but you get that like spinning wheel effect that we hated when everything was just like one React app and you land on it and it spins and then the whole app comes in. We still need to do that in some places to kind of sprinkle in that dynamic information that we only can get when a user visits. And if we now go in our Stripe, you know, we have a Stripe session in there, and then we could create, we could then use Stripe as a source and source in all of the checkout sessions that have been completed and get that travel data, and then generate pages from that travel data, making sure none of the you know, private stuff are passed through. And we could make then one travel page per travel if we wanted to, but then there will be a little bit of a time there where it will be a mismatch. You just traveled and you land on this page, and that page hasn't been generated. So Gatsby has some ways of handling that, where you can say, if the page hasn't been generated, then use this template. If it has been generated, use the generated page. And our next session will also be on what's coming in Gatsby 4, which will make this a lot more interesting. But any questions about that, like dynamic, static thing? Ivo?
Yes, in the end, you will need to publish a server anyway. It's a static, but it generates static stuff, but you are working with requests and response, so you need a Node.js server to publish there.
Yeah, so this is where this is where Gatsby is going to make money, right? So we all the way in the beginning, we did a Gatsby build, and we got that public folder that you could basically copy paste to any kind of static hosting, because it's just HTML files and you can serve that. But now we have gotten into the land where like our site is statically generated, but we're also you know, we're also building these little serverless functions that are deployed as serverless functions, and they need to be handled these functions, they need to be handled as serverless functions. And the funny thing with serverless, I mean, there's always going to be a server, right? So correct, like there will always need to be servers, but in this kind of realm, we are now kind of more in that serverless realm where our site is statically generated, our functions are kind of statically generated and then living as serverless functions that then can be called from our front end. And you could also, call any API from your front end that is available from the front end to sprinkle in that dynamicness. Like here, when I reload here, we could have asked another API, but because Stripe keys are secret, like our secret Stripe keys should never be given away. If we put that in the serverless function, then our serverless function can talk to Stripe, and then our site only talks to our serverless function. But yeah, we'll never get away from servers, will we? So where I was saying Gatsby will make money is that Gatsby Cloud will obviously become the best location to deploy our Gatsby sites and our Gatsby serverless functions. So I think that's what they're betting on, kind of money-wise. It's the same with Vercel, who is now focusing on Next, which is a competitor to Gatsby, where Next sites are best deployed to Vercel, Gatsby sites are best deployed to Gatsby. But then you have Netlify in the middle, where that, like, their whole selling point is that they can then host all of these different types of Jamstack sites. So it will be interesting to see who kind of wins out, or if there's room for all of them.
And for the simple use case, of course, you could just build locally and commit to a GH pages branch and host for free on GitHub. Right? Yes,
I've never tried that though, but yeah, you should be able to do that. But for a simple site, all of these solutions do not charge you any money. So for very simple test sites, I would just use any of them to just get a feel for the whole flow, because because they have very generous free plans.
Cool.
Yeah. So then we can talk about, because interestingly enough, like I kind of said that at its core, we're almost running out of time, but at its core, Gatsby is a static site generator that pre-builds all of our pages and then rehydrates. Then they added serverless functions, which is not kind of a part of the site that it's generated, but our serverless functions they deploy alongside of your of the site that you're deploying. What I really like about serverless functions from Gatsby is that it just makes it so much easier to get started with serverless functions, because we're just in this npm develop kind of environment. You don't have to remember to set up things. You don't need to proxy things to make sure that they are sent the correct way, but they are limited. If you're doing large scale serverless architecture, you won't stay on Gatsby. You will use something more powerful with queues and all of those kinds of stuff. But for many use cases, this is like a great addition to your Gatsby site. But then now they have decided to take it a step further, probably or most definitely because Next, which is their competitor, has always also had serverless or server-side rendering. So Gatsby 4 is now like, it's still static, but it's generated dynamically. Like, these words are getting very confusing. So they are still going to be static site generation first, which is different from Next, which has had like a focus more on a mix. So I think that Gatsby will always be very focused on statically generating as much as possible. But they have added different what they call rendering options. So what we have done in our demo here, like all of these pages and all of the pages we created inside of our Gatsby node will be statically generated ahead of time, right? So they have then, that is the SSG. Then they have added something they call deferred static generation. Because one of the problems that Gatsby has had is that if you have a page with like 10,000 content nodes and you have to generate all of those pages up front, that is like a high cost. Then you're talking about, I've heard reports that some people, it takes like 15 to 30 minutes to generate their site. So they will come up with this deferred static generation, if you look at the image, which is like the first time you then ask for the about page, it creates it at that point. But if you go the next time, you will get that statically generated page. But interestingly enough, it talks to their Gatsby DB, which is built at build time. So if you've changed the about page information before you're hitting it, then that change won't like come in until this database is changed. So you still have to generate the site on every content change. You need to do a rebuild, but for the pages that are marked to be deferred static generation, DSG, they will not create kind of the HTML for it until somebody hits that path. But it will get the data from this Gatsby database. If I have this correct, like this came out a week and a half ago, so haven't had the time to play around with it a lot. We're going to play around with it on stream on Thursday. And then in addition to that, they have, as said, Derek, just good old server-side rendering, which is kind of what we're used to, right, from WordPress and everywhere. When somebody hits the page, then it's generated on the server for each visit. So in the Gatsby 4 world, I could then take the success page and change that to a server-side rendered page instead of first loading kind of the app Chrome and then having my use effect go and fetch that information. I could then do that on the server instead and then render the page and send that back to the user.
So this is to optimize the build step, right? Not having to pay that cost, as you said.
Yes, I think definitely it's to optimize the build, because that is one of, there's trade-offs with all kind of situation, right? With I remember, from a traditional approach with WordPress or Drupal, you end up spending a lot of time optimizing the cache, because you don't want these things to be generated on every visit. So you end up like adding cache in front of it to make sure that pages that don't change that often are not created every time somebody visits. While in a static site generation kind of paradigm, you get the opposite problem where you have the cache, no problem, but how do you handle pages? Like this server-side rendering will then handle the pages that you don't want to have like a long cache life of. And then the DSG will handle the build step, which is the problem when you end up building the cache for the whole site, but nobody ever visits that blog post from 10 years ago. You don't want to spend time generating that page ahead of time. So it's just like, they each have their challenges, and you need to know your tools and when it works, and you put measures into place. So WordPress, you put the cache in front, and with Gatsby, you now have, but we do need SSR every now and then, and we do need to not build every page under the sun every time something changes.
Awesome.
And that is in beta. I think they're going to go out of beta like in January-ish. But it's probably like their betas are usually pretty solid. So if you're going to start working with Gatsby now, it could be good to just jump on 4 right away. But not all plugins will be, not all the plugins will be updated to Gatsby 4. But it's not such a big difference. From Gatsby 2 to Gatsby 3, there was like huge changes. While from Gatsby 3 to Gatsby 4, it's more of an addition of functionality and just some smaller changes.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Magda, how are we on time?
Yes.
3 minutes late.
Yes, thank you so much, Benedicte. It was very interesting. So I guess all the questions was answered, right? Is there anyone else with questions? No? Okay, so thank you so much again. Before you go, how can we follow you online and where we can go to learn more? Maybe there is.
You can
Some
head
last words you can
on
say.
over to my Queen page and sign up for the newsletter.
Sweet.
Or there's Twitter, of course, where I am Raae. And yesterday we had Gatsby co-working, which was pretty nice. We're going to do that again. So if somebody starts playing around with it, can show up for co-working, and we'll help each other move forward with our Gatsby projects.
So good luck with that. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope we'll see you again.
Yes, I guess I'm just logging off now. I'm sorry there were so many problems with the package stuff in the beginning. I need to figure out how to make sure that is always in sync when I do these demos. Other than that, I hope that you enjoyed that. It was very hands-on, and you could see kind of how we build up these pages instead of just talking very generally about static generation and the data layer. I feel like the data layer, you just have to go in there and start digging around and looking in the GraphQL visualizer, and that's the way you kind of learn it instead of trying to start by learning GraphQL.
Excellent. You're awesome, Benedicte. Thank you so much.
But thank you, and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.